Hi. APC64 is AKAI's new flagship Ableton Live controller, and it now also has a built-in simple standalone multi-track MIDI and modular sequencer. It's got plenty of I/O, and it's even a MIDI and CV interface. It's got a fairly original design with touch faders on both sides of the grid, and the pads on its 8x8 grid are both velocity and pressure sensitive. The touch faders have color LED strips, which along with the small screen help you figure out what you're controlling. As a standalone sequencer, it's got 8 tracks. Each track can contain sequence with up to 32 steps. You can create custom layouts and store both the layouts and the sequences in one of 24 onboard projects. In this video, I'll take a look at what it can do in depth, both with Ableton Live and as a standalone controller, with pros and cons compared to the competition and the previous APC40 MK2 from AKAI. Before I start, a quick disclosure: AKAI sent APC64 over for review. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video, and you don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with an overview. Unlike the previous AKAI APC, this is a 2-for-1, both a controller dedicated to controlling Ableton Live, and it also has a simple built-in standalone sequencer that lets you control hardware and even modular synths, as well as software synths on your computer. It also has MIDI and CV I/O, so you could look at it as a MIDI to CV interface. In terms of overall layout, it's got an 8x8 grid of both velocity and pressure-sensitive pads. They're RGB pads, so they match quite nicely with Ableton projects. You can use them in one of several modes. The thing Ableton Live is most known for is launching clips, or entire rows, called scenes. You can also use these pads in note mode to play either drum kits on drum tracks, or in note mode, notes on melodic tracks, or even chords in chord mode. Beside that, you can also use the grid as a step sequencer with 32 steps on top, sequencing various instruments and triggers over time. In this case, modular gear, but you can also sequence hardware instruments as well as software instruments on your computer. You can also create your own custom layouts using the APC software. So here, for example, I created a layout which I find more intuitive to play than these grid layouts. And you can use the APC64 editor software to create your own layouts with any of these shapes. So either a chromatic piano style layout, a scale layout, or just assign drum pads to trigger anything you want out of these options. And if the default colors aren't to your taste, you can always customize them. Custom layouts also include custom colors and CCs for each of the 8 faders per project. Like I mentioned, you can store 24 projects, and you can easily swap between projects. And then you can also use the grid to change settings. So for example, in note mode, if you double click this or shift tap it, then there are a bunch of settings you can set here, and you can use the screen to figure out what's what. So for example, these will set out chord shapes for chord mode. These will change the root note. This chooses one of 16 scales, so you don't need to remember what's what here by heart. One of the important settings you'll learn quickly is to toggle between standalone mode and Ableton Live mode. You can move between tracks using the arrow keys or turning this encoder. And if you've got more than an 8x8 grid of clips, then you can long press session and travel around the session that way. Anyway, speaking of faders, when you're controlling Ableton Live, they do a bunch of things too, depending on which of these buttons is enabled. So as you may guess, in device mode, they change device parameters. So say, for example, it's easier to see, I think here, they'll change the first macros They're organized, by the way, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7, and 8. I think it would be more intuitive if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. I mentioned this to AKAI and they said they'd consider it. Anyway, these can control device parameters. You see which parameter you're controlling when you touch the fader. And then you can go through device parameter banks of macros in this case, or swap devices left and right while holding the device button. Here too, I think it would be nice if there was an option to do this one-handed as opposed to two-handed. One more important thing about the faders, the RGB LEDs match the color of the track, which helps you figure out where you're at as you navigate the grid. So that's pretty much it for device mode for the faders. Then there's a volume mode, which, as you may have guessed, controls track levels. And here too, it's color-coded, which is excellent. Moving on, they also control pans, again color-coded, sends, and the way this works is you've got sends per track. This is send A, and then you press this again and you toggle to send B, and you see which send you're at over here on the screen. Then there's a channel strip mode, again color-coded, that controls levels, panning, and sends. And finally, there's an off mode to prevent you accidentally changing parameters, which did happen to me a few times, especially as I was putting my hands here using the shift key or mute, solos, record arm, and so on. If you do change things by mistake, then luckily the undo button is nearby as well. The faders, by the way, fully support multi-touch, which can come in handy in a performance situation. Besides controlling Ableton Live, the APC64 is also a simple standalone sequencer. It has 8 tracks, and you can designate each track to be either a melodic track, like in this case, controlling different instruments, or a drum track, in the case of track 8 here. Each track hosts a sequencer, a step sequencer of up to 32 steps, and the sequencer is polyphonic. The sequence in each track can be up to 32 steps, but it doesn't have to be. So for example, in this track, I've got a 6-step sequence. Let's solo it. And if you go into the sequence settings, into the track settings, you can choose for each track where you want it to send its information out, whether to USB, to MIDI, to CV, or to all three. So for example, this track 3 is sending CV and gate out to OXI 1, and track 2 is sequencing Blofeld over one MIDI output, and then track 1 using the other MIDI output to control Moog Sirin. And the drum track is mapped to send information out the remaining 6 CV/gate outputs. So in this project, I've still got 4 tracks free, which I could use to sequence, say, external hardware gear if I had a MIDI through a splitter for these outputs, or just software instruments over USB on my computer. Then these 8 tracks with a 32-step sequencer for each live, like I mentioned, in a project, and you can store up to 24 projects and swap projects in real time while you're playing. You can also chain adjacent projects by holding the first and last project in a chain. For the most part, the sequences live in a parallel universe next to Ableton Live sessions, but you can either send or receive clock into here, so you can have them in sync. And once you've created a sequence here, you can also send it to Ableton Live by holding Shift and pressing the encoder. And you can see it has created a clip in here, and this is what I sequenced over here. This is the drum track. You can't, however, at least not currently, send clips from Ableton back into here. Then to complete the overview, as you can see, the APC64 has plenty of buttons all around the grid. On the right, you've got scene launch buttons to launch scenes, or if you're in step sequencer mode, then you use these to edit velocity, probability, and mutate, which is pitch randomization that works on melodic tracks. You've got transport controls on top, play, stop, and session record. I don't mean to sound lazy, but I kind of wish they were on the bottom, though they were on top on the APC40 MK2 as well, so I guess no one complained. Then the first row on the bottom, the track select row, as you guessed it, selects tracks, whether you're controlling live or the step sequencer. Then this bottom row, the control row, controls either arming tracks, muting tracks, soloing tracks, and for session view also acts as a stop clip function. Stop all is a shift function here, by the way. On the right, you've got a screen which shows you a bunch of things. For example, the track names, the device name, and the macros you're controlling over here. I already mentioned it also helps you figure out what's what in these various control screens, and you can also use it to edit global settings, which there are quite a few of. The screen's very small. It's LCD, but has fairly good viewing angles, and next to it is a click and push encoder. On the left, we covered these buttons, the fader buttons. Then you've got a few utilities, settings, shift, which obviously accesses the functions labeled under the buttons. I'll talk about a few Ableton Live tips related to this later in the video, but if there are any buttons that are, in your opinion, missing, and obviously there are a few, for example, quick access to locators or blooping, then you can always go ahead, create a custom layout and map pads to those functions with MIDI mapping. In terms of build, the APC64 is plastic, light, but it feels solid. The buttons have a satisfying click and they're backlit. Size-wise, I'll put exact measurements on the screen, but let's take a look at it compared to what are probably its main competitors. It's smaller than Push 3 or 2, and also smaller than the APC40 Mark II, and wider than the LaunchPad Pro Mark III, obviously bigger than the smaller LaunchPads. I'll talk about pros and cons compared to these and other controllers at the end of this video. In terms of connectivity, APC64 has got 2 TRS MIDI outputs. These are copies of the MIDI out, so they're not addressable separately. And then you've got a TRS MIDI input. You can connect these directly to TRS MIDI gear or use these dongles to connect the gear with regular 5-pin MIDI inputs. It comes with 3 of these dongles. Then you've got 8 CV and gate outputs that can send out between 0 to 5 volts. You can use these outputs in quite a few ways. For example, to send out CV gate pairs to play synths polyphonically if you want. You can also use these to send out velocity, aftertouch, or CV based on the position of the faders. It's powered via USB-C, which also sends MIDI back and forth. When you connect it to your computer, you'll see 4 ports, MIDI and CC coming from the custom layout, a DAW port, a MIDI port for the input, and notes played with the controller. So that's it for the overview. Let's take a look at a few things in a bit more detail. Note mode has a few interesting settings. You can either shift or another tap on this will get you to them. You can set the root note. And then if you choose a scale mode, you can choose to either show or hide the scale. So if I go back into the note mode, here I see only the notes in the scale. But if I double tap this again and show the notes that are out of scale, then you get the more traditional layout. You can transpose the grid using the arrow keys. You can choose the intervals between rows. This works a little bit differently than other controllers, at least currently. It's at least currently a diatonic layout as opposed to a fully isomorphic layout that you might be used to. I asked AKAI about that too, and they mentioned they might add an isomorphic option as well. And then in chord mode, you've got a few options depending on whether you're in a diatonic mode or in a chromatic mode. So when you're in a scale mode, you'll always get chords with notes in the scale. And then in the chromatic modes, these 3 options apply, either major, minor, or diminished. The chord and note modes are more or less the same for melodic tracks, both in Ableton mode and in standalone mode when you use the sequencer, but that's not the case for drum tracks. In Ableton Live, a drum track can have as many pads as Ableton Live will allow, way more than 16. But if I go to a drum track in standalone mode, then you'll see that drum pads only have 16 different values. You can change these values over here in the settings, just by pressing them actually, and choosing a different note, but then they'll apply for everything in that project, for every track in that project. If you want to change the CCs in custom mode, by the way, currently you'll need to do that through the app. You can't do that on the controller. Okay, let's move on and talk about sequencing. There's sequencing into Ableton Live and then sequencing using the built-in internal step sequencer. I won't talk much about sequencing into Ableton Live because there are plenty of tutorials about that online, including one that I made. I'll link to it below. But just to give a taste of how this works, I've created an empty track with a piano instrument on it. The active one is armed by default. You can choose to record into a track by pressing one of the clips in the track in session view, or just by hitting record if you're in the note view. There are a few things you might want to set before you start recording. For example, the metronome, you can toggle that on and off with this. So this is one of the beauties of the Ableton Live workflow. You just hit record and record something. Excuse that. And hit record again to stop recording. If you don't want to remember to hit record once you stop recording, you can set a fixed length for the clip you want to record, up to 32 bars. Let's just go for 1 bar and then activate fixed length. Again, one of the beauties of the workflow, you hit record and it'll just open up a new clip under the one you recorded. So that's our 1 bar. And then there's the matter of quantization, meaning timing correction. Ableton Live has 3 types of quantization, so it can get a bit confusing. You can apply quantization to a clip that you already recorded. So to do that, you just hold quantize, choose the quantization, then go into session view and just hold quantize and apply that to the clip you want. Let's say this one. You can also quantize while recording by hitting Shift and turning this on. Doesn't stay on, by the way, for some reason, but it's on now and it's off now. The thing is, the way Ableton Live works, you need to go into Edit and then change Record Quantization over here. Let's leave it at this. And then finally, there's Launch Quantization, meaning time correction for the launching of clips once you've recorded that you change using Shift and these buttons. Let's talk about recording automation. I've loaded up this project. And let's say that I wanted to automate a transition, a parameter in a transition between these 2 scenes. And I wanted to edit that over here in this clip on this track. I can choose the device that I want to automate in this chain. Let's go say for transit. To create an automation, you need to enable automation in Ableton Live. That's something you need to do either with a custom mapped button or just manually here. And I want to duplicate this row. So I have a transition version and a non-transition version. And I want to go to this one. Then enable MIDI overdub and hit play. Once you've created an automation, the tip of its little fader will turn red. You'll also see the automation on the faders. Anyway, that's automation and sequencing from within Ableton Live. Let's head on out to the step sequencer. Now, this can work whether you're using standalone gear or within Ableton Live, and whether you're in session mode, or Ableton Live mode, sorry, or in standalone mode. If you want to use the sequencer, you'll want to move to standalone mode, even if you're playing instruments on Ableton Live, because when you're in note or chord mode and changing tracks, then you'll change internal sequencer tracks as opposed to Ableton Live tracks. A good hint as to whether you're in live mode or standalone mode is that the session button is off when you're not connected to Ableton Live. So it's on in live mode and off in standalone mode. For consistency's sake, let's say that I wanted track 8 to be a drum track. You edit sequence settings by pressing the step sequencer button and then pressing the track you want to edit. You've got track length here. Let's say make it 16 steps and choose whether I want it to be a note track or drum track. Let's go for drums. You can also choose a relative speed for the track and a MIDI channel. Ideally, you'd want the track in Ableton Live or your hardware instrument to listen just to that channel. And if we go into note mode, by default, the notes are mapped to what works within Ableton Live as well. Sequencing drum tracks is more intuitive than sequencing melodic tracks. Basically, you choose what it is that you want to sequence and then just drop notes on the sequencer. So we've now sequenced the kick. You choose the note you want to sequence on the bottom left quadrant. Then you choose either velocity or probability for drum tracks and mutate for melodic tracks. And then velocity can be either as hard as you press, so hard or light, or one of a few set levels you choose in the bottom right quadrant, and you edit probability the same way. You go into the probability view and then hold the note and choose its probability. So let's make these not trigger every time. So that's probability. These will either trigger or not based on the probability. Let's just sequence one more instrument. Let's go for this. And then one more thing you need to know, you can either select what you want to sequence or deselect the active pad, which gives you a view into which pads have notes across the sequence. And then if you press one of these pads, you'll see which notes are active within that step. You can also clear entire steps this way as well. Sequencing melodic tracks works the same way. I'm sequencing Siren here. You just pick a note and then drop it wherever you want it to play. So you can also create ties by holding Shift and extending the last note. Here too, by the way, deselecting a note will show you all the steps with notes on them, and then you can press a step to see which note is sequenced in it, and you can also sequence polyphonically this way. So I've got 3 notes triggered here. Let's clear these. The step sequencer doesn't have a metronome like Live does. Besides step sequencing, you can also record live into a track. You can only record live into one track at a time, but just arm it using record arm. And the record button doesn't have any function here. As long as the track is armed, you can play live into it. But at least as of the current firmware, this doesn't support micro timing, and ties aren't recorded either. So you'll need to add them manually, which is quite tedious when you play polyphonically. So hopefully they'll add that as well. Then the one advantage that melodic tracks have that drum tracks don't is the mutate function. So you just hit a note and choose how much you want it to be mutated. Mutate is the probability that it will transpose within an octave. That's pretty much everything there is to know about step sequencing. You can set the relative speed of the entire pattern or of specific tracks relative to the pattern. And these faders send CCs based on what you determine. In this case, they're mixing up Sirin, and they're the same for all 8 tracks. So you don't get different faders for each of the tracks, and you can't automate them. At least not within the step sequencer. You can, of course, if you're sequencing through Ableton Live. Once you've created a sequence in terms of performing with it, you can mute and unmute tracks. And you can also mute and unmute individual drum pads. If you deselect them and hit mute, hold mute, and choose what you want to mute or unmute, you can unmute all quickly with clear and mute. Okay, before we head out to the pros and cons, a few tips and tricks for using this with Ableton Live. First, a note about polyphonic aftertouch. It's something you need to enable in the settings here. Here we go. Turn on polyphonic aftertouch. And then, if you'll notice, polyphonic aftertouch is getting kind of messed up here. And that's because Ableton Live loves to default to MPE these days, which is different than polyphonic aftertouch. So make sure to disable MPE mode, and then polyphonic aftertouch will work as expected per note. Another thing you may notice when you load up a device is that you go into device mode and you can't control any parameters. That will happen with a device that has too many parameters for Ableton to auto map. Just hit this little arrow, click configure, hiding here, and then tap the parameters you want to control with the faders. You'll see them added here as well. Then exit configure mode, and you'll control them from right here. Notice also their values and the parameter name show up on screen. You won't need to do this for plugins that don't have too many parameters. So say, for example, let's go into Raum. So its parameters are already mapped over here. Don't forget, if there are more than 8 parameters, hold device and swap banks here to control 8 totally different parameters. Next tip, I hinted at this earlier, make custom layouts for things you want to do with Live that you can't do with the controller. So for example, if you don't like this note grid layout and prefer a piano style layout, you can create a 4-octave piano style layout, which works with polyphonic aftertouch, by the way. You can actually use the pads in between here for commands. So let's say that I wanted to map this pad to, say, enable automation. I could go ahead into MIDI mapping, choose this, and then hit this note. While we're here, let's add record to arranger and say looping here. And I can now control these functions from these buttons. By the way, I recommend mapping the top row buttons to custom functions. That way you can one-handed hold this, edit a parameter, release, and go back to where you were. Same goes for these faders. So for example, I could set this fader to control master level, this to control Q level, and just in case you miss the DJ crossfader, you can also control that. Note that I've set this to a pan style control so that it fits with controlling a crossfader. All of this is done in the APC editor. You can see, for example, here I set this fader to a pan style control. In this context, one important thing to remember is to go ahead and set remote to on for the custom port. One of the buttons I think is missing here compared to the older APC is the ability to lock device controls to a certain device. So as I move around the tracks, I'll control the device that's on that track. But what if I wanted to stay locked to this device? You can't lock it using the controller, at least not in this firmware, but you can do that within Ableton Live, lock to APC64. And now as I move tracks, these will still control the one device that I locked this to. You can't unlock it from here either. You'll need to find the device and then do that over here. If you know of a way, by the way, to send a MIDI command to do that, let me know in the comments section below, because then you could map that in the custom layout. Another tip, if you want to use the sequencer in conjunction with Ableton Live, so sort of draft ideas in the sequencer and then maybe send them to clips within Live, don't forget to match clocks. So if we go to standalone mode, custom settings, so either set sync to, say, over USB if you're connected to Live, or send out sync over USB to Live and slave Live to this if you want. And then when you're setting MIDI channels for tracks, don't use channels 1 and 16 because Ableton uses them. It uses channel 1 to sequence melodic tracks and channel 16 to sequence drum tracks. And once you've selected a MIDI channel for your track, make sure that the track on Ableton Live is listening to that particular MIDI channel. One more way to enhance this, there's no note repeat function here, but you can add an arpeggiator MIDI effect to each drum pad. You can even set each pad to a different rate. And voila, you've got note repeat. Then a final tip about latency, since you'll probably be using this to play into Ableton Live. Aside from the usual suspects, which is setting the buffer size and the sample rate if needed, but typically the buffer size will do. Set it to as low as you can without getting clicks. Sometimes it doesn't help to set it too low. Doesn't help much in terms of latency. So this is pretty reasonable, but sometimes you'll get additional latency because of plugins in your project. To fix this, go to Options and look for Delay Compensation. Uncheck that, and it will dramatically improve the latency situation. Okay, let's take a look at pros and cons for APC64, and I think we need to look at it as two products. Obviously, it's nice to get both in one place, but the markets for standalone sequencers and for Ableton Live controllers are pretty different. Let's start on the sequencer side. APC64's sequencer is very simple. That said, it doesn't have much competition at this price range, so indeed it doesn't have features you'll find on higher-end sequencers like automation of parameters, micro timing, MIDI effects, longer sequences, and so on. But if you want all those things, you'll need to pay close to double this price just for a sequencer, and you likely won't get an Ableton Live controller bundled in with it. The one obvious exception is Novation's LaunchPad Pro Mark III, an interesting competitor because it too has a built-in sequencer and 2 MIDI outputs. The LaunchPad Pro Mark III doesn't have CV outputs and dedicated faders if that's important to you, and has fewer tracks, only 4 in its sequencer, but its sequencer itself is slightly more advanced than the APC64's, with micro-timing, a mini session-like grid, and a few other features. If you don't have to have this pad layout, KeyStep Pro is also an interesting competitor at around this price range, though again only 4 tracks, not 8, and no Ableton Live integration. Then there are other step sequencers with no Ableton Live integration like the RK008, Novation's Circuit Tracks, which is also a Groovebox. Let me know if you think of others in the comments. Then moving on to Ableton Live Control, there are a few categories of live controllers. Keyboard-based alternatives with fewer pads like the Arturia Keylabs or Novation's Launch Keys. They give you fewer pads and a smaller window into Ableton's grid, but they come with a keyboard. In the grid category, you've got a range of choices all the way from the APC Minis, smaller launch pads, and then the APC40 Mark II from AKAI, and of course on the more expensive and higher end range, Push 2 and Push 3 from Ableton. I know both APC40 Mark II and Push 2 are discontinued, but I think they're still relevant comparisons to this. In terms of size, APC64 is smaller than Push and the APC40 Mark II, yet bigger than the LaunchPad Pro Mark III. That's of course because these faders take up space. Then another thing to think about is that touch faders aren't knobs. I know it seems obvious, but you can control more than one parameter at a time. With faders, touch faders have the benefit of changing automatically as you move tracks. The only thing better than this is motorized faders, but obviously these aren't tactile like real faders or knobs. Its screen is tiny for sure. Obviously it's better to have this than not, say compared to a LaunchPad Pro, but this obviously pales in comparison to a big screen on Push 2 or Push 3. It's obviously too late to add a little screen for each of the faders, but man, that would have been cool. Still, you can see what you're controlling as long as you're touching it on the little screen. A few more things comparing this to the APC40 Mark II. The APC64 has fewer hands-on controls, but has quite a few advantages to compensate: a full 8x8 grid as opposed to 8x5. Its grid can also be used to play notes and chords, and the pads are velocity and pressure sensitive. And of course, there's the built-in step sequencer and the additional I/O. Also, the parameter rings on the APC40 aren't color-coded like the faders here, which helps a lot in terms of orientation regarding the track you're controlling. APC40 also has a physical crossfader for the DJ function as opposed to something you need to map over here, as well as per track AB buttons, again something you'll need to map manually here. So while there are a lot of improvements in APC64 compared to the APC40 Mark II, quite a few hands-on controls have been dropped. So those were specific comparisons. Overall, I think the main pros for APC64 are an excellent Ableton Live implementation, a fairly competitive price relative to Push when you consider what this can do, its connectivity, and simple yet effective built-in sequencer. That said, obviously Push 2 and 3, while they cost more, can do a lot more. Then in terms of cons, I mentioned quite a few things throughout the video. I won't repeat them all, but the highlights are that it is easy to sometimes accidentally touch these faders when you're handling this area. So either have undo handy or turn them off. The step sequencer is relatively simple, with only 32 steps, no microtiming or ratchets or automation. And then on the firmware side, there are a few things I wish they'd add, like recording ties when playing live into the sequencer. I also think it would help to have a view that's more than just 4x4 for entering notes into the sequencer. Perhaps maybe expand note control to the entire bottom half of the controller. And then while you can customize this quite a bit, it would be nice if you could also customize the CCs that the faders send in custom mode on the device itself as opposed to using the software. So that's it for APC64. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.